Hey, what's going on, Matt?
Hey, Steve, how's it going today?
Doing all right. I guess it must be Thursday afternoon. It's time for one of our live training sessions.
Hey, what's going on, guys? Are we busy right now?
What are you doing here?
Oh, is this training time?
Yes,
Oh, my goodness.
You're just in time all the way from
wow.
Southern California. Rob Haynes is joining us, and apparently it's only Rob Haynes, but we also have Matt here. He's going to guide us through tuning a system. If you don't know who I am, my name is Steve Treese, VP of Tech Services. We are coming to you live, all three of us, from our Southern Florida location, the main mothership, as Rob likes to call it.
The knowledge base.
The knowledge base, yes, indeed. So I'm actually excited about this session. If you've been following any of the sessions that we've been doing, we've been really focusing on learning how to use Tune and Max for measuring and tuning your audio system. And most of the time when we do this, we've been doing, I guess, what most would consider very high-end systems. Usually they have like C7 products in it and W7s. And we decided to kind of take a slightly different approach. We wanted to do something that may be a little bit more normal. And I think we did a good job. We have a vehicle that has a pretty basic audio system that we're actually going to go through and tune. So Matt is going to guide us through that, but there's a couple of things I kind of want to lay out for the training. So if we could call it the keynote.
Absolutely.
Oh, that's not the keynote.
That's not the keynote.
There we go. So like it says on the slide there, we're going to demonstrate how to do impulse response measurements and for a passive system. So this one has coaxials in the front. So it's not a separate tweeter. So we're going to show how to do this with a passive system where it's a coaxial, or if you have a component system with a separate tweeter but a passive network without a dedicated channel for the tweeter. And then we're going to kind of talk about, we call it a loop back, where the signal starts in one amplifier and then kind of loops back around into the amplifier again. And that gives us the opportunity to take advantage of what we call a global EQ, an equalizer that'll affect the entire system instead of each specific band like we would traditionally do. We'll still do that when we can, of course, but this global EQ gives us a lot more flexibility as we do the later part of the tuning, or as we like to call it, the salt and pepper, right? And as a constant benefit of doing this, it gets you more familiar with the tuning process of getting the repetitions. And I think all three of us would have to admit that the more you do this, the better you get at it and the more comfortable it becomes.
Absolutely.
So the more we can do this, the better we'll all get at it. So next up, I want to kind of show what the system is that we have in store for you today.
Sorry, I'm not used to doing this all here.
Not California time. There we go. So we're dealing with the Ford Fusion, it is, right?
That's right.
Yeah, it's a Ford Fusion. So we have a source unit that's going to go into a VXI, VX400/4i, and it's going to power up 4 main speakers. So there's it's basically factory speakers, and we added a separate tweeter, and then the rear speakers, just in the back. And then we have the output from that going into a 250 watt mono amplifier, powering up some a single W0, right?
That's correct.
And if you'll notice, there's a little blue hook thing that's the digital loopback. So what we're going to do, we'll show you the system setup. We're going to take the analog signal that comes in from the source unit. We're going to go out the optical output on the VXI, loop that right back into the optical input, and then from the optical input, we're going to route that through all channels on the VXI, including the preamp out for the sub. So that's what we're going to do. And I want to go real quick, remind you of the tuning process that we would typically follow. And we're going to guide you through all of these steps. The first and most important part of this is going to be to complete your installation properly. And then, of course, verify that the system is completely wired correctly. So whether you've done the installation yourself or if you're taking this on from someone else that did the installation, if you skip this step, I can promise you 9 times out of 10 it's going to bite you in the butt.
All right, out you go, Matt, to look at the car.
All right.
So don't skip this step because it can really save your time and the backside of things. And once you have that actual wiring and everything confirmed, you need to go into the software and confirm that the setup in your software matches what's actually in the vehicle. So just because it says it in the software doesn't mean that's how it is in the vehicle. So make sure these two things line up. And once you've got that done, you jump over to your measurement settings and make sure that all your settings for your measurement is going to be what you're anticipating. Just a quick run through to make sure that's all the way it's supposed to be. And then we jump into actually analyzing the data. So as we're looking at the data, we might make some changes. We might make we might have to reconfigure the targets. If it's not lining up exactly the way we want, we can actually alter those things and dial in and configure the targets. There we go. And once we have that all dialed in, that's when we get into what I call the time-based measurements. We start looking at the impulse responses to set our initial delays, our initial delays, right?
Initial.
Okay. So once we have that all dialed in, that's when we do what I call it's curve matching, where we will, do high and low pass filters, and we'll start doing the equalization, and we're going to take advantage of a micro automation we call auto set EQ to target. And then after that, we'll start doing, Matt and I had a really good conversation about this earlier, the phase and summation analysis. And I contend that we look at phase, we talk about phase, but I don't really care about phase. I care about the summation. And one thing that Matt shared with me, and I've learned over the years with him, is we look at phase to get it lined up, but we verify it by looking at the summation. And that's the important part. The phase obviously will guide us to that, but we have to confirm that by looking at the summation. Summation is king. And after that, we're going to talk a little bit about what we can do with those rear speakers to integrate those into the audio system. And then our favorite condiments, the salt and pepper. That's when we're going to get in the system, and we'll go through and kind of listen to it and make any changes that we think might be necessary. And that's when you're going to use that global EQ, right?
That's right.
Fantastic.
Excellent.
So enough of me. Rob, if you can go ahead and switch over, we're
Yep.
going to bring up our computer here connected to the audio system, and I'll let Matt take it away.
All right. I'm hoping everyone's doing pretty well today. So what we have here is, as we spoke about, we have a three-way system. And although it's a three-way, it's a two-way passive and then the subwoofer. So overall, it's a tweeter, mid-bass, and subwoofer, which contributes to the three-way system. And what we're going to look at here is how we would go through and tune that system. So we're going to first look at the setup tab and confirm that everything matches the install that we did. So what we have here is we have input signal coming into inputs 1 and 2 of our 400/4. And then we go down through our EQ bands, and then we send that signal out of the pre-outs, the optical output. Now on the amplifier, we took an optical cable and we just looped it from the output to the input, right? So it's pretty straightforward. It's just a cable that's there, so you can hide the wires or whatever you choose to do with that. And then we have signal coming in on the inputs here from the opticals. So we have optical in going to each one of the speakers. And then from there, we have signal going out through the crossovers and then the DRC and everything else. So what we're going to do here is we're going to go to our measure tab, and we're going to configure that next. So we go to the measure tab, and we're going to look at the measure settings, which are up here in the top left corner. And when we go to the measure settings, the first thing we want to change is the trace folder location. I like to make a big deal out of this because it is very important that you create a new folder so you know which car you're working on, and you can go back and reference these later.
Even if it's the same car, like in my car, every time I go in, I make a new trace folder. Rob Tune V2, Rob Tune V3, so I can easily know which tune I'm looking at when I'm looking at those traces.
I love that you always point this out, because if you forget to do this, you can always move these files later. They're just basically computer files that you can move at any time you want, but you're gonna forget. And when your future self goes back to look at that data, you'll be very confused of what's going on with that. So if you do what Matt's recommending, and I do recommend you do that, you create a new folder for every tuning session. You have a date on that, you have the name of the vehicle or however you want to name it. Then all of the captured files will be in there, and name them appropriately so that you understand what it is. If it just says Mike 1 data, you don't know what that is. So be clear, and basically you're leaving a little note for your future self to come back and say, now I know what that data is. So you could open it and look at it, maybe kind of get an idea, but it's much better to take Matt's advice. Believe me, he knows what he's doing. So well, at least on that anyway. So
one thing to add to that is, if you do have all these traces in a folder, right, you can always come back and reference them later to send them to the customer. So if the customer downloads Tune at home, or even if you wanted to print these out and give them to the customer, you can say, okay, this is what you paid for. Here's your Tune file. Here's your traces. This is what your integration looks like between your drivers. It's really helpful when you when you have a Tune file, and you can go back and reference those traces. So
I'll jump in real quick and add to that. If you're dealing with our tech support team and you're looking for guidance on how to get better results, sharing those traces, we can actually bring those up and look at them and say, well, we see what's going on here. We can help you with that.
That's right. All right. So we're going to get back into the measurements here. So we're going to look at our signal coming in. So we have signal coming into our microphones. Currently, all of our speakers are muted, and we have no filters or anything applied. We already reset all the outputs here. So you can right click, reset all outputs. You can see everything is back to 0, right? So we don't have any active tweeters in the system, so we don't have to be concerned about setting
That's
a
a good
high
point.
pass filter on
point.
the tweeters. So we can leave all the crossovers off temporarily for our initial setup, and we can look at the raw data to determine if the targets that we are going to use are going to work for us. So I'm going to unmute our first speaker. And first thing, well, let me actually start with playing signal. I'm going to hit play on our signal
That
generator.
helps, huh?
Yeah, it does typically. So once you hit play on the signal generator, you can see if we unmute this speaker, so we have a little problem here. We have clipping on our input here. So what we can do is we can reduce the sig gen level. So we just bring this down and
let me slow you down a little bit.
go ahead.
Just for reference, what Matt's got going on is the max measurement system is connected to the computer, and we have a signal generator that's sending signal out of the RCAs that's then going into the audio system. So when he pressed play on the signal generator, that passed the signal through into the system, and as soon as he did that, you saw the meter get pegged. The microphones are receiving too much energy at the microphones, and that's causing the input to clip. So that shows up red in Tune software. It'll show up as red. It'll also stop the measurement as another hint that, hey, you got something wrong here. So the bright red and the no measurement, that's usually a pretty good hint. So there's a couple of things that we could do. And what Matt chose to do was lower the level of the signal generator, which then has less signal into the audio system, less signal through the audio system is less signal at the microphone. Everything's good. He also could have taken the DRC level and brought that down a little bit as well. There's lots of ways of reducing that level. SigGen is definitely one of those, and it's a good one.
Okay, cool. So let's see where we're at. So we're gonna go ahead and select on our input drop down here. We're gonna select the multi-mic input so we can see our signal coming in. And I'm gonna switch this to the line view because I'm not a fan of bars.
Really?
Then,
Rob is.
I thought we were going to one tonight.
I feel like I've heard this joke before.
So
They
actually,
never get old.
real quick on some of the things that Matt just shared. The multi-mic is the default configuration that comes on Tune 4 when you connect it to Max. And basically what that means is it comes with a 5-mic array, and the multi-mic is going to average the signal from all 5 of those microphones. And it basically does them in sequence. So what you're going to see on the screen is an average of all 5 microphones, creating a spatial average wherever they've been positioned. So that's kind of what you're looking at here. And much like, Matt just shared, I don't like the bars either because as we start getting captured traces, it obscures some of that data. So having the lines, you can still see some of the other captured traces. We chose to use bars as a default because a lot of people are used to seeing those. So we wanted it to be nice and comfortable. You can change it and you're all good after that. So
Absolutely. All right. So from here, what I'm going to do, I'm looking at this measurement. It's still a little high compared to our targets here. So I'm going to bring this level down a bit more.
So he's looking at the blue trace, which is our live data. And you can see kind of bouncing around a little bit. That's as it goes through the spatial averaging. And as the energy in the vehicle is changing, you'll see that dynamically updating. And the target curves are the yellow, purple, green, gray, and red that you see along the bottom edge. So what Matt's doing is he's positioning the live data closer to those targets because that's where we want to operate, close to those target levels. And know that he's got plenty of output in this audio system. So he's not worried about bringing the level down because he hasn't affected the output at all. He's just brought the signal generator level down. So there you go. Sorry.
No worries. All right. So what we're going to do here is we have to choose a target that fits the speakers that we're working with. So the speakers that we have here are, as Rob showed earlier, it's 4 factory speakers in a Ford. So they're 5x7s, as you guys probably know already. And if we check the different signals, they all seem to be about the same band. They're playing pretty well from low end to top end.
Wide range.
Definitely not looking good in the lower mid.
Well, we'll get there. First, we need to determine which target's going to work for us. So what we're going to do is we're going to switch to targets mode, and then we're going to load a target. Now, we have to consider what speakers we have control over. So although the front speakers are two-way, it's a woofer and a tweeter in parallel, we cannot change the way the tweeter plays, right? We can only change the entire signal going to that speaker tweeter combo.
So the tweeter doesn't have a dedicated channel.
Correct.
So you can't do any direct manipulation through the DSP unless it's a dedicated channel.
Yep. So that means that although this is a 3-way system, we're going to use a 2-way target to align to. So I'm going to go ahead and open that target. Okay. So now we can see that there's a 2-way target on screen. So we have the red target is the main target, which will take care of the woofer and the tweeter. And the purple target is the subwoofer target. and the yellow is the sum of those. And if I cycle through to the yellow trace, you can see that comes to the front of the graph there. And now you can see, here's the blue trace again. So what I'd like to do is, being that these are factory speakers, they're probably not very capable, you think?
There's a good chance of that.
So our typical targets here are set up at 80 hertz. I'm going to go ahead and change that to 90 hertz, just because I don't want to put too much stress on those speakers. And I contend that the 12WO can probably handle itself better than those can.
I would
much,
guarantee that.
much better. So
as Matt makes those changes, the first thing he did was he undocked the panel for the high and low pass filters, the crossover
that's
filters,
right here.
and he engaged what's known as high and low pass tracking, high HPF, LPF tracking. And by doing that, he can make a change on one of the selected fields, which he chose the high pass on the mains and the low pass on the sub. And he can change the value at the same time so that the summation of the sub and the main speakers remains consistent. So it's not going to move things on them too much. There we go.
Sorry about that. Hold on one second. So,
So you got to turn on HPLP
yes,
tracking.
it was off. It was off.
It was off.
All right, so let me select that again.
The power and fun of a live demo. So
There we go.
So you
now-
see, as the purple and the red are changing together, the summation, the yellow line doesn't change. The sum remains consistent when you do that tracking, which is very cool if you ask me.
Yeah, the coolest part about this is you can do it while listening to the speakers. And
Well, right now we're doing target, so it would make no change, but you could do
Right.
it on the live data as well, the actual live high and low pass filters. But on that note, just bear in mind when you're doing it with the live system, if you go too far down, the main speakers may not like that too much, especially if you have a dedicated tweeter channel. So yes, it's a cool feature, and I do it blind tuning, where I don't look at what I'm doing, I just kind of listen to it. If you do that with a tweeter channel connected and you just go too far, you could cause problems.
Yeah.
So
Definitely don't want that.
a little experience talking there. So
all right. So now that that's done, we set these targets at 90 for the crossover point for the sub and the mid bass. So our targets are set, and what we're going to do, we're going to go through and we're going to start IR measurements. So at this point, I'm going to switch my graph here to linear IR, and there are a couple different impulse response graphs that we have available, and I'll probably show both of them just because we can here. And I'm just hiding these targets on screen so we don't see them in the way. But I'm going to unmute the first speaker. And if you guys have been following our process that we've been talking about a lot, what we typically tend to do is we start by looking at the first speaker, and then we
still have your targets on the top one.
Yes, I do. Let me hide those targets too, so they're behind. So now what I'm going to do, I hit the auto scale button, which if I hover over the button, auto scale the y-axis, and then I'm using the X zoom so that I can zoom into the beginning of this IR. And you can see it actually zooms on both screens at the same time, which is pretty cool.
So Matt just did two really cool tricks. The auto scale, the y-axis, basically takes all of the data and makes sure it fills the entire graph that you have pulled up. So it'll just automatically scale it. Then he used the x-axis zoom control. And if you noticed, he did a really narrow thing right at the very beginning.
Let's do it again.
Yeah, so basically what that does is it's going to zoom into that really tight area, and it just poof brings it right up to the foreground, and you can see the very beginning of the IR. If he went really wide with it, it wouldn't do much. It just kind of moves it because it's a wide zoom at that point, if that makes any sense.
All we care about is that initial rise. So that little sliver he's zooming in on is all you need.
Right. So he's looking for that deviation, like Rob just said, the deviation from where there's no signal, and then there's suddenly the beginning of the impulse, the beginning of that rise or fall, depending on the direction.
Yep.
Right. So one thing that you can tell from the linear impulse response that you can't tell from the log is the relative polarity of a speaker, right? So if we flip the polarity here, you'll see that on this graph, the initial impulse flips direction. So on log, you can't see that information. Log is simply telling us the arrival of the speaker, but linear does give us that benefit. So that's typically why we use linear, because it can give us a better understanding of what's happening in the system in the beginning of the process.
So a bit more of a glimpse into what's happening.
Right. So I'm going to go ahead and set this as my reference delay. So there's a couple ways we can do that. I'm going to use the delay finder. So I hit find delay and hit insert into my reference. Now I'm going to zoom back out on this and then zoom back in so we can get back to the zero. And what I mean by the zero is now that we set our reference delay as the measured delay here, 54.06, that now is our zero. So anything coming from before it, this to the left is early, and then to the right is arriving later. So we have to find the latest arriving speaker. So we're going to go to the next channel. This one is arriving later.
All right, so if I may,
Sure, absolutely.
you know how I am. So
Yep, please explain better.
when you first start doing impulse responses, the only value that the system knows is when the signal actually starts, and that's called time zero. So what you'll see is there's a flat line, and then somewhere around the 0 point, you should start seeing signal. But if you don't, it's probably going to show up somewhere later. That means it's happening after the initial impulse was actually started. So that would show up on your screen further to the right. Things to the left of 0 is arriving early. Thing to the right of 0 is arriving later. So by default, everything's going to show up late, because that would be normal, unless something's really wrong. Right?
Yeah.
So what Matt's going to do is he's going to redefine where the signal's actually starting. And ultimately what we're looking for is the latest arriving impulse, which is the last sound that's getting to the microphone, if you can look at it that way. And then what we're going to do is we're going to delay everything else to that point. So now that's all going to arrive at the same time. So 0 is just the beginning, is what it is. So by default, it's at 0 because it's all we know. And we're going to create a new 0, a new time 0. And you'll notice in the software, if you call that back up, you'll notice in the software that in the middle there, that you can see that there is no 0 anymore. It's this new number, which I can't see because it's too far away.
54.06 is
right.
here.
That number is not important anymore because that's just a reference point at this point, and it's going to shift as we go through. Take it away. I'm sorry.
No worries. All right. So now this speaker, this is channel B, and we haven't done anything with this yet. So what we're going to do is we'll use the delay finder again, find delay. And this one's arriving later. So we want this to become our new reference temporarily. So I'm going to hit insert, and now that's our new reference delay.
And you see how it moved over, and now it's kind of centered on that new 0.
And you can see 0 is now 55.31 instead of that 54.06 we had to start.
Right on.
Correct. So now we're going to go to channel C. This one is arriving earlier. This is the left rear speaker, so it's actually pretty close to the microphone. So that makes sense why it's arriving earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And then channel D, this one is the right rear speaker. So this is actually arriving earlier too than the front speaker. It's imagine that. And now we're going to go to channel E. This is our subwoofer. Now, what's cool here is you can see the arrival in the log scale, but it's not as clear in the linear scale. So what's cool is if we just select the linear scale, we can hit the auto scale button again. And now you can clearly see that it's arriving here, and it is arriving later than our 0. So now I'm going to right click on this, and that will become our new 0. Right click also works the same as find delay and insert for the reference delay. It's the same function. Right click's faster for me.
Right. Your hand's already on the mouse, right?
Yep. So now at this point, we found our furthest speaker, which is the subwoofer in this car. This one's actually in the trunk. So
makes sense.
I don't know how long the distance would have been if I had a tape measure, but this told us exactly where it begins.
Well, I think one thing that's cool, like what you just said there, Matt, it's actually really hard to measure the subs in the trunk because where are you measuring to? If your subwoofers are facing the rear, are you measuring to the front of the enclosure? But then the subwoofer's firing off to the rear, and then you have reflection. So this truly does give you that accurate measurement instead of getting in the ballpark that you get with measuring.
But bear in mind, if you don't have access to the time-based measurements, you can use the tape measure to get pretty darn close.
Yeah,
and if you have a way of looking at the summation, which is ultimately what we want to do, if you have a way of looking at the summation, it may not be as accurate as fast as you want to be, but you can still do a pretty good job.
Absolutely. So from here on out, we're going to go back, and now we're going to set the delays on these speakers. And what you see here is I just unmuted one of the front left speaker here, and there's a lot more energy content here. So the graph looks crazy, and it's kind of hard to see. So we're just going to return the graph to the default scale, and then we're going to auto scale it and zoom in one more time. And now we can see where it begins. So now what's cool about this, I can keep it in this view if I just shift it over using the right arrow on the keyboard.
Yeah, don't go. This is a great view that's right on the screen right now.
Yes,
so you can see where the new 0 is, right where the cursor is right now. That's 57.37, whatever, it doesn't matter. But you can see that the signal is off to the left. That beginning signal is way over to the left. So what we can do, since it's arriving early, we have to make it somehow not arrive early anymore. We have to delay it.
right.
I'm ready to go back to California.
So there's a couple.
The great part is they can't mute me.
That's true. I mean, I can mute him all right. He might not like it. But, okay, so we're gonna go ahead and delay this one. There's a couple ways we can do it. We can use the delay finder again. So find delay, insert delta, and you'll see that it automatically populates that right into our DSP delay, which is right here, 3.33. So now I'm going to go to channel B. I tend to do it the quicker way. If I hit shift and I click right at the beginning of the impulse, it adds that into the delay field. So I can do that just a bit faster than the delay finder. So now this one I can't see. It's off to the left. And I can tell it's to the left because if it was to the right, the signal would look more like this. It would look more like a flat line. And if it's coming into the left, you could see that here's energy that showed up that wasn't there before. So signal, if I just hit left on the graph, there it is right there. So I'll just shift click on that and that entered it in. We can go back and confirm it's correct. And then channel D, same thing right here. So I'll shift click on the beginning of that. So now all of our speakers have been aligned to the subwoofer, right? And I can auto scale this so we can see it again. So everything is arriving at the same time. So for now, our initial delays are set. And just to be clear, these front speakers here, this is the woofer and the tweeter that's actually in this impulse response. Both of the content for both drivers are showing up right now. Steve, can you see where the tweeter starts or the mid-range starts? Can you see any of that?
Not easily.
Right. So what we're going to do is we're going to forget that it's two speakers combined, and we're just going to get the arrival energy starting at the beginning. And then when we get to the phase analysis later, we'll confirm that our initial delays were correct. And if they're not correct, we'll use phase to align everything in time. And that's where they become the final delays. So for now, it's just initial delays. Don't worry about the tweeter or the mid-range. You could cover the tweeter and play it.
Or just connect it if you wanted to do
Yeah,
that.
disconnect it. But
ultimately, why? You can't change it by itself.
exactly. There's no benefit. Right. So, all right. So now let's get on to our RTA now. So I'm going to switch this view down here on the bottom to RTA, and I'm going to make this full screen. Hopefully this makes it easier for people to see. And we're going to unhide our target. So we have main, subwoofer, and target, and sum.
Right.
So now we're going to bring our blue trace. You can see that my cursor, when I move it around, it's got a yellow cross wherever it crosses the yellow trace. That means the yellow target sum trace is on the front of the graph. We call it the Z order. You can change this by either going up to the input drop down and you can select multi-mic. And now you can see my blue cursor is the front of the graph. Or I can just hit the Z key and the Z key cycles through so you can see different traces here.
Hey, Matt.
Yes, sir.
The blue trace is jumping around an awful lot. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
So it depends. The blue trace moving around can be helpful when you're doing filter, when you're adding crossovers and high pass filters, low pass filters, because you can quickly see what that filter's doing.
Okay.
But once we get to EQing it, we'll want the trace to be a little more stable. So we'll go through and set that up. But first thing I want to do here is I want to set my high pass filter. So I'm going to set it at 24 dB Linkwitz-Riley at 90 hertz because that's what we set our target to. So let's start with that and see how it looks. And I'm going to use the minus key so I can see a little more information on this graph. So this is an OEM speaker, right?
It shows.
I saw someone make a comment. It's okay to not protect them because, maybe they'll buy some new speakers, right?
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yep. I know where I could get a good set of C2s to replace these with.
Scott's on it.
Scott is a retailer. For the consumers that are watching, what Matt's recommending here is try not to force too much energy through your factory speakers because they will not have the capabilities that a typical aftermarket product would have. So by protecting them, we could still get some really good performance and not damage those speakers. When you do take Scott's advice and update those speakers, you can get a lot more dynamic capability, a lot better mid-bass capability, and all those things, all the benefits you'll get from a higher quality product. Hopefully some JL Audio product, but whatever product that may be, then you might need to go back in and retune and try to get a little bit more love from those speakers. So.
And even with aftermarket speakers, don't try to force them to do things they're not supposed to do.
Exactly.
It's factory or aftermarket. But being these are factory, we're going to be a little more conservative than we can probably be with a good aftermarket speaker.
I agree. All right. So then what we're going to do here, if you guys look at this speaker right off the bat, it's not very pretty. The speaker's a little rough, and that's kind of what we expect from factory speakers. So what we're going to do at this point, we're going to try and make this the best it can get. I'd like to see what you guys think. If you can put in the chat how close of a window you think we'll be able to get these to, maybe plus or minus 10 dB or plus or minus 6 dB. If you guys want to come up with a guess, and we'll see how close we can get it. So
what Matt's referring to is that it's not so pretty, is that there are huge deviations, particularly in the lower mid-range and the mid-bass region, that there's massive issues in terms of smoothness of the response, and ultimately we wanted to match those other lines. And
you want me to make it smoother? Hold on, let me make it smoother for you. How's that look?
Boxy. But honestly, even at that, it's not that pretty. So Matt's challenge to all of you right now is, while he goes through the tuning process, if you can take a guess of how close he'll be able to get to those other smooth lines.
We see plus minus 5 dB from TJ.
TJ's got some confidence in you.
Okay, all right. Let's see.
Don't let him down.
All right.
I'm looking at huge deviations there. It's like
it's
10 or 12 dB in points, but go ahead, Matt. Sorry.
No worries. All right. So what we're going to do here, we're going to use the auto set EQ function for this. So we engaged a high pass filter at 90 Hertz, and I'm not going to force the bottom end of the speaker to play this because I will break it. So next we're going to go to the EQ panel, and that's right here under the EQ at the top of the graph here. If you select, you can hit EQ panel, and you can hit show EQ to bring up these EQs on screen. The letter E on the keyboard also toggles them on and off.
E for EQ. Look at that.
Yeah, who thought of that?
There's some smart people somewhere.
So our selected data is our multi-mic input. Our output is our left front two-way, which is right here, our friendly name. If you named your outputs, then that's what'll show up here. If you didn't name your outputs, then shame on you. And then the target is the mains. And on our target here, we do have T1, which is the red trace. This is mains. So that's how we know what it is. So I'm going to go back to output mode. I'm going to click the, so before I go to auto set EQ, I'm going to slow down the averaging so that it stabilizes the trace a little more. So I'll probably go to like 2-second averaging.
So I'm going to jump in real quick on that. When we were developing the software and the hardware system, we realized that there's easy ways of doing things. We call those the defaults, right? But it would be a lot easier if we had fewer options. But it would also restrict the system. So we didn't restrict it. We'd rather kind of share with you some of the insight to it. The 16 FIFO, to Matt's point earlier, will show some dynamic signal. So as you're making changes, you'll see that the shape of the response change pretty much in real time as you make those changes. 16 FIFO is 16 first in, first out. So it'll take 16 samples, and then the first one that came in is the first one that goes out, replaced by the 17th sample, and then the 18th, and so on. And it keeps dropping out the first sample as it goes through. And that goes through pretty quickly. And that's why it's pretty dynamic. But by slowing down that averaging and going to like 1 or 2 or 4 seconds, it becomes really stable. It almost looks like it's off. Right? So if you start making changes with your EQ, it's not going to immediately affect it, but eventually you'll see it come into the shape as you make the cut or the boost on your EQ.
Right.
But what's really good about this auto set EQ is it's going to look at the data as a snapshot and then apply the equalization. If that snapshot is always jumping around, it's not as accurate when you do the auto set EQ. So by stabilizing the data, we can do the auto set EQ better. And then ultimately, if we want to make changes later, we can just speed up the averaging again. So we gave you options.
All right. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and just select the auto set EQ button, and we're going to let Tune do its magic. And there we go. Now what you're seeing is the data's taken a little while.
I'm too impatient
to refresh. So the V key, as in Victor on the keyboard, you click that and it refreshes the data. So now we can see it, and it refreshes immediately.
That's pretty good.
Yeah, it's not too shabby. What's our
so yeah, so we're right there.
I'm just gonna look at the one half of it. It looks great.
So now what I'm looking at here though is Tune did something that I may or may not be concerned about later, where number 3 is actually at plus 6 dB. And you have to just be mindful when you use the auto set EQ function. It doesn't boost a lot, but when it does boost, you just want to be mindful and check on that later. If you hear some weirdness from the system and your speaker doesn't sound right, try bypassing that and see if it goes away.
So there's another thing about the software that may be beneficial in this exact case. So if you turn that filter back on, you'll notice the orange line with the shading. That's showing where the boost is actually being applied above the 0 point.
Yeah.
So there's only a very little amount of energy that's really truly being boosted. It's shaping the curve, but it's not actually putting a whole bunch of extra energy because of the way the filters interact with each other. Most of that is cut, and you can see that very clearly with the orange shading below that imaginary line across the middle there. So it's only that little tiny, little blurbs there, technical term, the two little blurbs that are actually going to increase the amount of energy over a very narrow band in a very small area. So I wouldn't worry about that at all. If you saw a ton of energy above the curve, that would be a little bit more concerning, but I got no problem with what you got
and
there.
This isn't that like a low frequency. This is around 450, 500. So it's probably
Right on.
nothing to be concerned about, but just something to keep in mind as you're going through. So now we're going to go to channel B and hit the V key to refresh it. And this one looks great. I don't know if I'm going to be able to do Scott's challenge.
Scott's. I think Scott's is kind of be funny there.
Yeah.
He's having a laugh. I don't know if you are.
Half a dB
Half a
on
dB.
factory Ford 5x7s.
All right, so we're going to engage a high pass filter on this speaker as well at 90 hertz. And check that out. Looks pretty decent other than these massive nulls. I probably can't do anything about this, but I may be able to help these if I just give it a little bit more boost here. Let me make sure these are unchecked so it only selects this channel. So I'm going to go ahead and add 3 dB and then hit refresh. And that gets us a little higher than target here. So I'm going to go down to 2 dB. I think we're pretty good because now our high pass filter sort of lines up with our curve here. And most information is above the target except for the null, but we can't fix that. So
it's a pretty nasty null too.
Yeah. So now we're going to go ahead and auto set EQ that guy. And you can see when you selected the new channel, the output changed to the new output that's selected, which is really nice. So now hit the V key. And that's pretty good.
I like how Tune is smart enough to not even try on that null.
Yeah, it didn't see Tune, it ignored it. That's pretty cool. So now we're going to go to the next channel. Now this one, see, this also is boosted at 6 dB, but it's what frequency
Very
is
little
that?
above.
137.
Right.
So that
and the amount of actual energy there is tiny.
Right, but it could or could not be something we should check out later. So now we're going to go into C, and we're going to set a high pass filter on that guy. This is a rear left speaker, so we're going to go 90 hertz on the high pass filter. And you can see that we're actually losing some energy down here in the bottom end, and it's likely because the microphones are in the front seat and the speaker is behind the seat, right? So it's blocking all that mid bass. Yeah. So I imagine that's probably what's happening there.
Yeah, that would be logical.
I don't say many logical things, but
this is true.
All right, we're going to add a couple dB here on the level trim and raise that up to try and get this area. So it looks like that helped us to get this area above the curve or close to it. And we're going to go ahead and auto set EQ that guy.
One thing I like, and as it finishes its routine there, that the micro automation for auto set EQ to target is not the end result. It's just a beginning result. And you, as the system tuner, had the ability to make changes and determine if the settings that have come up are suitable or not. So when Matt was pointing out about those peaks where there was a boost applied, you can say, I don't want that, and you can change that. It's not the end, it's simply the beginning.
Right. And here's an interesting one. So number 3 here is also boosted by 6 dB, but it's actually just boosting the cut energy.
Right.
So it's actually not applying, it's barely applying any boost. It's probably only a half a dB or less that it's actually applying there above the target. So it's,
to illustrate that, can you bypass the 2 filters above and below it?
Yeah, absolutely. So 2 and 4, right? So 2 and 4.
So that's if there was no other filters, you'd see that would be a huge boost. And that would be more of a concern because it's over a wider area and it's more significant amount of additional energy being asked at those frequencies.
Right.
But this isn't what we wanted. This isn't what we would do. We would keep those filters engaged to create the shape of the measured response the way we want. And that boost isn't actually a boost. It's a compensation for 2 filters interacting.
Yeah, that's pretty good. All right, so now we're going to go to channel D, and we're going to do the same thing. Let's see what we can do here. First, we'll start with our high-pass filter at 90 hertz.
As he goes through this, every time he pulls up these measurements, I'm thinking to myself,
brutal.
wow, some aftermarket speakers would solve a lot of these problems.
I'd say. So this one here, actually, our high-pass filter lines up really well. This is a massive null, so I'm not even going to attempt to boost that. I'm just going to leave it alone. We're going to go ahead and EQ that.
Now, we are pulling energy out of the system when we do that, but I think we have enough power on tap that we can compensate for that later, right?
Yeah, probably, but we may end up blowing some factory speakers.
Right. And we'll have a sale one day. And Scott, hey, you know.
Yeah. So I'd say that's pretty good. I'm going to leave that as is. The high pass filter is very close to the target there, so
That's
I'm
really
pretty
nice,
happy with
actually.
that. So now we're going to go to channel E, which is our subwoofer. Okay, and
Yeah, it's off the chart. It's perfect.
that's right. We're going to start with the low pass filter here, and we're going to go to 90 hertz on that and refresh. All right, so there's our low pass. So now if I bring the energy down from this sub to try and bring it closer to the target, what you see is we actually start rolling off early. So
Yep.
we have two options here. We can either
Leave it.
bring this way down,
No.
and then we can raise the low pass filter
Okay.
right higher like this. But then your low pass at 180 hertz, that doesn't make much sense. So I'm going to go back to 90 hertz. I'll leave this at 0. And unfortunately, right now I'm going to cut all of that great fun bass energy out of it.
Wait,
So
hold on. And can you move the EQ over a little bit? Right now, you have that DRC slider all the way to the top. So the fact that there's a lot of extra energy, you can technically taper that off if we wanted to, right?
yeah, so I could bring this down, right? And I have to hit the refresh button. Hold on a second. I might not have that selected as my DRC.
So remember step 1?
Yes. Remember step 1. Don't forget it. All right. So here we go. So now if I bring this down, you see the energy slopes off as well.
So I actually think tuning it around at various different points on the DRC allows us some more flexibility at the end. Let's face it, you guys don't want to kill the bass. You want a lot more energy. I would actually argue if we brought that down, right, and did our adjustments with it down a little bit, we can always go
Like
back up and add
3/4.
some of it back.
Right. Absolutely. The other thing to note, though, we are at 0 dB on our subwoofer
Yes.
output. So we can also go up higher.
Gain
there
it
at
up
the
there,
end.
yeah.
Yep. So we have a couple ways we can do that at the end. My attempt here is to not castrate the
Good,
bass,
perfect.
but we want to make sure that we also make logical choices. So that's why I chose 90 hertz.
Sure.
And I'm going to EQ this the way it is, but we can always take those EQs out once we're in the car if we don't like the way they sound.
It's a
right?
beginning, not an end.
So I'm going to bring up the EQ panel again, and we're actually using the pre-outs here for our loop back as well as for the subwoofer, because this is actually using a separate amplifier, the 250 watt amp that's powering the sub. So the pre-outs are feeding that. So we're going to EQ the pre-outs, but the pre-out EQ is also our global EQ. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to bypass some of these EQ bands, and I'm going to leave about 3 available for the subwoofer.
Okay.
And
I got to just jump
Yeah,
in on that.
go
So,
ahead.
so what Matt's basically sharing with you is kind of I don't want to say it's an undocumented feature, but it's a feature that you should be aware of, that the auto set EQ is going to use whatever filters are not currently being used or turned off. Right. So if you've already EQ'd the system, those filters are already applied. It'll only use whatever filters have not been used. So by turning them off, you're basically holding some of them back. So when the auto set EQ routine is run, it's only going to use the remaining not turned off filters to try to equalize, whatever channel you're equalizing. So in this case, the subwoofer. And the reason we're doing that is because the other 7 bands are going to be used for that salt and pepper, that additional tuning a little bit later on as part of the global EQ. So by holding them back, it's not going to try to make all those changes in the subwoofer. And I mean, really, I can look at that, and probably 3 filters is more than enough to get that done. So, well, I guess we'll see if I'm right or not. So let's go ahead. Yeah.
Well, what I'll actually do is a test. We'll turn them all
there you go.
on, and then we'll run it and see what it chooses to do. Right? If it uses a bunch, then we change it.
Maybe we can free up 1 or 2 more.
So it used
Use 3.
3. So look at that.
Hey,
So
I called it.
now I hit V for the refresh, and I don't really love what it did here. So I'm gonna raise this high pass filter just a little bit, or the low pass filter just a little bit, to try and get some of that energy closer to the slope.
Oh, I'm gonna bother you, Matt. I want to illustrate what you were originally trying to do that I messed you up by saying what I said.
Sure.
So I'm gonna say, can you kill that EQ, like reset all of that?
Yes.
Right?
Yes, I can do that.
Right.
Sure.
That costs a lot of money, doesn't it? Yeah.
Free.
Free. That's free.
Yeah.
Can you turn off all but one filter?
Yeah, absolutely.
So in this case, we're going to hold back 9 of the 10 filters, and we're going to see what it can do with just a single band of EQ. Who knows? I have no idea what this is going to do. But if this works well, you can see that it wasn't as good, right? We need a little bit more if we want this to
So you
truly
wanna
match
give
the
it 2?
target. Right.
So there's 2. See what it can do with 2. That's pretty good.
So now we have 8.
Good.
We have 8 filters that we
Yeah.
can use to do the salt and pepper trick a little bit later on.
Yeah,
So-
yeah, absolutely. So then I'm good with this. I'll leave this alone. And remember, this energy that we pulled out can be removed later if we don't like it. It's
Restored
just-
later.
Right, restored. We're just taking it out temporarily to match the curve. So now we're going to go and look at phase analysis, right?
So real quick, since we're transitioning to time-based measurements, Sean Mullen had a question that came in when
Okay.
earlier we were showing when we turned off bands 2 and 4 to show, I think it was on the rear speaker. When we turned off 2 and 4, all of a sudden we saw that big boost that wasn't there
Mhm.
when 2 and 4 were on. Would that create the need for an all-pass filter?
Okay. I would say no, Sean. That would absolutely not create the need for an all-pass filter. EQ and frequency-based adjustments do absolutely have an effect on phase, but they don't have the same effect that an all-pass filter has on phase. So I will demonstrate that as we go further through this process. But no, changing the EQs will not cause the all-pass filter behavior or a need for one.
Yeah, really the all-pass filter is when we need to add another wrap
Correct.
to match the other speaker that it's being compared to.
Correct. So we'll probably get into some of that shortly here. All right. So going from here, we're going to go ahead and minimize this graph, and we're going to go to phase analysis. So I'm going to go back to 2 panes here at the top right of the screen. Select the panes icon, and
What a pain.
Yeah, I'm going to hit the phase graph on the top graph
Torch
here,
passed.
and I'm going to hide the targets here. See, the targets generally come up when you start a new graph for the first time. So I'm going to hide those temporarily.
Just for the record, the target generator does have all the related data for both level, frequency, and time. So you can look at all of those. But in reality, when you're tuning, we usually just use the frequency and level, and we don't really use the time-based measurements as part of the target. I guess technically you could, but you chase yourself like crazy. If you look at the phase graph that's on the screen now on the top, you'll notice that it's not quite as smooth. And yes, Matt, I know we can apply smoothing, but in general, when you look at it, it's a bit more chaotic because it's the actual acoustic phase of the measured system. And the target's never going to look the acoustic phase without a ton of smoothing is never going to look quite as nice as the target phase.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you can get an idea, but I wouldn't do it. I appreciate what Matt did by turning it off. It cleans up the screen and allows us to focus on what really matters.
Absolutely. The targets are a good way to learn about phase, though, to figure out what should the system be doing.
Right.
It will look different, but the target is the perfect world. It's like a piece of measuring a piece of wire.
Right.
So
Okay.
We're going to go ahead and move on. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to mute the subwoofer, and I'm going to look at my left front mid-bass speaker, and I'm going to capture this. And by capture, I'm going to capture it on screen actually, so you can see it. So up here on the right of the graph, there's a little capture icon. If I select that, I can name this front left mid-range phase, right? And then I'm going to go right to the bottom graph here. I'm going to turn off the EQs using the E key, and I'm going to capture this and call this front left mid-range RTA. Okay, so now we've captured both of these traces separately because this the time-based measurements are always captured on mic number 3 when using Max, and the RTA, the multi-mic input is a different color. So that's a good telltale sign to know that you're looking at two different measurements, red versus blue. There are two different signals coming in, so you have to capture them separately. So now that we've captured the front left mid-range, we're going to look at the front right mid-range to compare. Okay, and I hit the V key. So what we can see here is right in the mid-range area, like right around 75 hertz there, there's a additional wrap on the yellow channel that is not there on the red channel, right? You guys see that?
Yep.
And the RTA response you can see is very similar, except for down the bottom end here. It looks like the green trace, which is the left front. So if I select this graph, the green trace, this null that's happening here in the bottom end, that's causing that wrap. Okay. So what we're going to do here is we're going to apply an all-pass filter at 75 hertz.
This is below the region that we were working with earlier related to Sean's question, right? I think that was at the higher frequency.
Yeah, that was somewhere around 150, 100 or so.
Yeah, it looks like it based on that. Yeah, so, okay.
Yep. So now what we're going to do, we're going to put our cursor. If we put our cursor right here where the wrap is, you can see at the top of the screen at the in the information display, it says 74 hertz. So we're going to go ahead and type that number in here, 74. And then we look at the Q value and we can see our channel just shifted.
We got that extra wrap now.
Yep.
It did create an extra wrap, but
It's in
the
the wrong
bottom
spot.
end is not lined up anymore. And the top one doesn't have the same angle, right? So to change that, we use the Q value here. And if I just keep adding Q value.
That's the coolest thing.
And that's going to narrow the width of the all-pass filter, correct?
Correct. Just like it would with an EQ band. The
So
higher the Q value, the
the
more narrow, and the lower, the wider. Correct, Rob. So we're almost there. I'm going to go just a little higher here.
On
And
the
what
Q,
you'll
right?
notice is the red trace is now showing up a tiny bit earlier, or I should say later, than the yellow trace. So what I'll do is I'll go back to the frequency and I'll hit the shift key. And what shift does, it allows me to move the value in smaller increments.
Yeah.
So if I hit shift and I hit the up arrow, we're just going to keep clicking the up arrow until we overlay it perfectly. How's that?
Looks pretty darn good.
That's really cool. I love that that happens in real time.
Now, you know what? I probably got a little ahead of myself here, and I probably shouldn't even bothered with this all-pass filter until we check the summation of the left and right and see if the all-pass filter is necessary.
Well, I think it's okay because we can show before and after now.
Yeah.
Again,
Sure.
It costs us, what, 3 minutes? You're
Sure.
fine.
Okay. So let's, what I'm going to do, I'm going to capture B on the RTA. So I'm going to capture this and call this right front mid-range RTA. And then we're going to play them together. And now that we have both traces here captured, we can actually see that right where this behavior is.
Is there a way to maybe clean
Yeah.
up the RTA, take some of those?
I'm going
traces
to
off?
change the color of this blue one so we can see it better. Let's go red or orange.
There we go.
Okay. So now what you see is the green and the orange are the speakers individually, and the blue trace is the sum of those traces. So if we zoom in on this area, so I can hit my little zoom control here. And if I zoom in right there, you can see that the blue trace actually has some cancellation right around 85 hertz, 86 hertz. 86 hertz, that's a big deal. That's
a critical point.
our crossover point. That's the bread and butter of the system, right? Getting the phase right at that point to make it sound good, get to the impact.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go back to the default scale for that graph. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to re-engage this all-pass filter and then hit the refresh button. And look at that. I'm going to zoom back in on it just so you can see it clearly. The blue trace now does not track below those frequencies around 85 hertz. It's actually, we got summation here now.
Right. So let me just,
Sure, go ahead.
as I do, right?
Yep.
What we're looking at is the green is one speaker by itself. The orange is the other speaker by itself. When you add the two together, at no point should the sum of both of them be less than any one of the others. If you're adding to it, it should always be a positive influence.
That's right.
If it's not, that's a cancellation. It's a lack of energy as a result of them being out of alignment in time. Right. So what you've done there with the all-pass filters, you've improved the alignment in time at that range of frequencies so that they don't cancel anymore, that they I'm going to say they sum, but they're not summing well. There's still an issue there because we're not getting a strong summation. We're just not getting a cancellation.
Right.
So, okay.
All right. Now, with what you just said, you will notice there are some spots up above that may not actually have good summation.
Mhm.
And a lot of it has to do with the null in the orange trace that's
Yeah.
causing it to not go above that line.
Right.
But it's looking pretty good.
Yeah.
So
For factory speakers, really, that's
For the
pretty darn
limitations
good,
we're
right?
working with.
Yeah.
all right, so now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go back to this phase graph up top, and I'm going to hide the yellow trace, and I'm going to capture this trace, and I'm going to call this both mid-range phase. And now what we're going to do is we're going to compare all the other speakers in the system to this, because we want the mid-range to be, the best it can be.
Right.
And we're going to align the sub to that and make sure that the rear is also aligned to that. So let's go to channel C and see what that looks like. See what I did there? 3 times. All right. So I've been hanging out with Steve too much.
You love it.
So what we're seeing here is this one also does not wrap, right? The red trace here does not wrap like the green trace. So if we play all 3 of these speakers together, the fronts and the rear left, and we look at this area in the bottom here, we have another null. So there's a problem there. So we can start by looking at the all pass filter that we engaged on channel B, and we can use that same one and then see how close it gets us and then make adjustments if need be. So this is 85 hertz and 5.71. So I'm going to go to channel C, turn on 85 hertz and 5.71.
And he was able to quickly jump over like that by hitting the tab key on the keyboard.
Right. That's right. Yes. And now we do have summation. Now, just because I'm going to see if I can make it any better, I'm going to turn off A and B and look at the phase. That's pretty good.
Yeah.
I mean, I could probably go down in frequency just a hair like that and confirm that that looks good on our RTA. And yeah, we're good. So now all 3 speakers are summed together well. So now we're going to turn off channel C and we're going to unmute channel D. And looks like we're going to have to do the same thing. So let's start at 85 hertz and 5.71. And man, that's looking real good.
That's great. I love it.
That's looking really good. So I'll turn off A and B again and compare directly. That's perfect. So now
Matt, I'm going to interrupt you just real quick on this one. Someone pointed out that some of the higher frequency stuff looks like there may be a need for an all-pass filter up there. And while that may be true, in this particular case, we only have a single all-pass filter to work with. So the choice that a tuner is left with is, where do you put that all-pass filter? So as a general rule of thumb, lower frequencies are far more critical for phase alignment than higher frequencies. And how high? That's up for debate to some point, but I would say anywhere from 1500 to 2000 hertz and higher. If you're seeing phase issues up there, they're less important than any issues that are happening below that point. So in this case, if I remember looking at the data right, the issue that Matt focused on was all well below 1000 hertz, and most of the issues that are happening up higher are above 1000 hertz, and maybe not so much above it. But of the 2 options that we may have, go low first every
Give me
single
that
time.
beefy mid bass.
Yeah, absolutely, because that's where phase is a more dominant aspect. It's not that it's not important up high, but if you only have one filter to work with, put it where it's going to matter more, and that's at lower frequency.
Yeah, I would contend that around our crossover region for our sub and our mid bass, if
Yes.
that doesn't sound right, it will be far more noticeable than the high frequency issues.
Right.
And if we look at the RTA response of the high frequency stuff, it's pretty good.
That's pretty
so
good, yeah.
It's not as bad as this green trace here where that big null is.
Right.
So we're going to try and do our best to fix that before we fix anything else. Now, if you look right here, like on this channel, there is another all pass behavior here, but we only had one.
Yeah.
So we can't fix that, and we'd have to go through every channel. But even though there's a wrap there, the blue trace on the bottom graph doesn't look bad.
Right.
So I would ignore it. The phase matters when it comes to summation and cancellation. If you don't have cancellation and you have summation, don't worry about the phase. Worry about the phase when there's a problem.
Looking at the phase allows you to determine what's causing issues with summation, and you don't have to guess. You can actually go right to the point, like Matt was able to do. He put in the values because he saw it on the phase graph, and when he lined it up, it was exactly where, or within reason, where he needed to be.
Right.
So, let me just reiterate that point again. While phase is important for the analysis portion, what you're trying to do is create proper summation. And if the summation is already good, don't worry about the phase. It's already good.
All right. So what we're going to do here next, we're going to mute that channel. I'm going to clean up this graph. And
When he
hide
says
these
clean up,
traces.
he's just hiding the traces. He could technically clear them and delete them and recall them later if he wants to. But he's like me. He likes keeping them available in case I want to toggle them on and off.
That's right. So now we're going to look at channel E, which is the subwoofer. And you can see that the subwoofer actually doesn't line up at all. It kind of spreads across the two other green traces there.
Mhm.
So, Steve, what tools do we have for changing time?
Well, you have delay.
Oh,
Okay, so let's add
There's a
some
little
delay.
dial here, right?
Now this is our reference, so let's add some delay and see what happens.
So it looks like it's walking down and creating a sharper angle on those wraps up there on the top.
Yes, that's probably. I mean, I could keep adding delay and we could get it closer.
Yeah, well,
Probably not a good idea, right?
Yeah,
All right, so
Yeah.
that's close,
Right.
but it's probably not right.
right, because you have that extra wrap down at the lower frequency, so
Yeah,
it's definitely
so let's go back to 0,
okay.
and then what else?
I love
can
that we
try?
can see this
I
stuff
know, it's
though,
so
and
cool.
and like see what happens if you add too much delay or
Yep.
the real time. And sorry, I forgot about this.
All right, so other things, I guess it's not really time, but like you could flip polarity,
All right,
and that'll change the phase
so let's
response.
check polarity,
Right. So,
and that's not helping either.
No.
yeah, so that didn't do the trick.
All right, so let's try. Since we already used some all-pass filters on the other channels, let's just see what happens. So
Yeah, what's one more?
let's go.
It's another all pass out amongst friends.
Let's go
right?
75 at Q5. Uh-oh.
Ooh.
Oh,
Tighten that up, maybe.
that's hold on. So we got to go a little higher in frequency. A little higher in
look at
frequency.
No.
And then we got to adjust the Q.
There
Hold
you
on
go.
a second. A
It's
little
a
bit.
process. We
Yeah,
got you.
we're going to adjust the Q some more. Okay, hold on. Let me see. Maybe I have to come down in frequency, up. I'm not
Weird
really
there,
liking that. So hold on. Let's see. If I put this cursor right here, 71. So let's go 71. Change our Q back. Whoops. Aha.
There we
Now
go.
that's looking good, right?
So
So
I
I had
crossover
to,
region, it looks really nice.
Yeah.
I had to play with this a little bit to get it to where I wanted it to be. But if I can hit the up and down arrows on this graph, so I can get a better picture.
It's rotating a cylinder, right?
Right. So our crossover is right at 90 hertz. So that's our most important interaction right there. The green, I don't think it actually is playing down to 30 hertz. That's a factory speaker.
I would think not. Yeah.
Yeah, it's probably some noise in the system, but we want to definitely look somewhere around 90 hertz. And we can confirm this by looking at the summation. So I'm going to click on the lower graph. I'm going to save this as capture by hitting the space bar. This is the sub RTA. And then we're going to unmute all of, let's do all the other speakers, right? And
All the main speakers are now playing, but not the sub.
right. So this is all 4. So I'm actually going to lower the level of all 4 of these now so that we're closer to our target. So I'm going to select all 4 of those and I'm going to lower the level until we're pretty close.
By clicking those little dots, the changes you make will apply to all of those
Yeah.
selected channels at the same time. It's a nice way of keeping things lined up once you get them dialed in relative to each other without messing up the relationship.
Right. Okay. So now I'm going to capture this and we're going to call this all speakers. Actually, before we even do this, I guess this is probably a good time to do the global EQ. So let me do the global EQ first.
And that's
So-
using that digital loopback we talked about earlier.
Yep. So I'm going to open the EQ panel again. I'm going to select the pre-outs and I'm going to unhide or show all my all-pass filters or turn them all back on.
And
I'm gonna
EQ filters.
EQ band.
EQ. What did I say?
All pass.
All-pass. Yeah, no, that's an EQ. EQ.
You get an all pass filter. You get an all pass filter.
Easy, Oprah.
So now I'm going to hit auto set EQ on this. And we have the multi-mic input selected with the left pre-out, which is linked to the right pre-out. And then the target sum is our trace that we wanted to match. So,
Ooh, look at that.
Whoa, those factory speakers look a lot nicer now.
wow, that's pretty good. What happened to those big nulls?
Well, spatial averaging and 4 speakers playing simultaneously.
Yeah.
True.
Can we
Okay.
zoom in a little more, Matt? And
Yeah, I'm going to make this graph bigger. I'm going to turn the EQ off and make the graph bigger.
again, he did that by pressing the E key.
So now I'm going to unmute the subwoofer again. So unmute the sub, hit the V key, and that was actually part of the subwoofer. You can see on the purple trace down below, that was the subwoofer. I'm gonna turn off the subwoofer just for a second while I capture these speakers, and I'm gonna call this all speakers, right? And then I'm going to turn the subwoofer back on, and now we can check the summation in this region. So we can see that the energy that's now showing up here is higher than both of the speakers individually.
The dip isn't a cancellation, it's an abnormality in the response.
Yeah,
exactly. So now, could we fix that dip? Maybe. I mean, maybe if I came in here and like if I stole band number 10, which isn't doing much, and I bring that over here.
Narrow the Q just a smidge.
So this actually illustrates that the EQ function, the auto set EQ to target, is not inclined to create any boost, just out of protection and frankly some intelligence on it. But as a system tuner, as a human, you could look at the data and determine if you're comfortable with making that change. Again, you're the one tuning the system. The computer's just helping you. And what Matt just did is actually pretty amazing. He looked at the data, he moved the band that wasn't really doing anything at the very high frequency, nothing significant anyway, and made a dramatic improvement on the overall matching to target of the entire system.
That's beauty incredible. Of full parametric EQ.
Yeah.
So let's see now. If you guys aren't familiar with cursor controls, up here at the very top, there's a thing that says cursor. If you hit set A, we can set A at any point and lock it by just clicking. So now that cursor is locked on the graph. And if I select set B, I can find the biggest null, right? Let's call it this. So now our biggest peak and our biggest null, and the deviation there at the top of the screen in the information display, negative 6.05 dB, which means it's plus or minus 3 dB using factory speakers.
That's pretty cool.
And a 12W0.
That is really pretty amazing. And it didn't take that long with all the chatter and everything. It was less than an hour.
Yeah.
We're a little over an hour, but
that's that was all the chatter in the beginning.
Yeah.
Me interrupting you a couple of times.
Little bad jokes.
That's pretty good. That's pretty good. So it's you know what gets me excited about this is not a high-end system. Yes, it's got a really good amplifier. We're using a pretty powerful measurement system, but it's factory speakers, a couple of tweeters added in, and a subwoofer. We got the VXI amplifier that is sharing its DSP capability with a non-DSP amplifier in the base. This is real. This is what a normal customer would probably aspire to have. This is actually really good. And the fact that using the measurement system, we can get it really, really close to that target curve. What's next is to get into the vehicle and that salt and pepper that you always talk about, listen to it and see how those interactions really show up to human hearing.
Right.
You know, remember that the microphones are trying to replicate the speed, the space that we're going to put our head. That's what the spatial averaging is all about. So however you want to go about doing that, once you get to this point, you move the microphones out of the way, you get in the car, you keep your computer ready and available connected, and you make minor changes on the equalization. You're not going to want to make a whole lot of time-based measurement changes.
Right.
You know, that should be dialed in. We saw the data, and you're probably not going to make huge changes in high and low pass filters, especially in a system like this where you're kind of at the razor's edge on a factory speaker in terms of its low end capability. So this is mostly going to be any issues in that mid-range where our hearing tends to be very sensitive.
Yeah,
but that's pretty good. So what was the guess? Did someone say plus or minus 3?
I believe we had that. Let's scroll back up in the chat.
Plus or minus
plus minus 6, plus minus 6, plus. So we, other than Scott's ridiculous plus minus half a dB, you beat all the expectations.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
So
that's pretty good.
There's that. I mean, and this wasn't me. This was the power of Max and Tune. It's really cool, and we really enjoy this stuff. So we got that system dialed in really well. The only thing we didn't talk about yet was like there's a couple different ways you could integrate the rear speakers.
Yeah,
right?
so what you did here, you just played the rear speakers as normal, but there are some tricks that you could do to try to make those rear speakers I don't want to say better, but integrate differently with the main system
Right.
to give some different effects. And it's kind of outside the scope of our normal conversation here, but that is something that's kind of neat. That's more of a VXI training than it would be a tuning with Max.
What I would probably do getting into this car when I'm all done, I'd probably lower the level of those rears, because for me they were pretty high being right behind the seat. So I'd probably lower them, maybe raise the fronts a little higher. And then do our salt and pepper, right? So Steve likes salt and pepper. He likes Steve. Now
I can't see your screen right now, so
we did use up most of the global EQ. But if you have like a factory radio or aftermarket radio that you have a little bit of EQ adjustment, you can sometimes use that.
The basic treble controls.
Steve tends to like a cut somewhere in the 2K region. And I mean, some people are going to want more bass. Oh, that's what I wanted to show at the bottom end here. This 12WO was pretty astonishing. If I reduce just a little bit of this EQ here, I mean, this 12WO is playing all the way down to 20 hertz with authority. So I would probably boost that up a little bit myself and let it play. Maybe not take out all the EQ, because I don't want the big peak, but I want it to be more natural. But
keep
at the
the
same
general
time,
shape, but just have it elevated more.
Get a
I'm
little
down
more
with that.
bass out of that.
I'd go for that.
And then any other things that we see in the system that we may want to try changing just to see how it sounds. We may like it better, we may not. And it's easy, it's free. Just click the button.
That's it.
I
That's
think
awesome.
For me, what this shows today, this is great for you guys that maybe are building your system in steps. And when I first started with JL Audio and we were working on the tweak, and I remember Steve and I touring the country, talking to dealers about their DSP business, because we were getting prepared to get into it. And at the time, I felt like it was almost like DSP was always put on the top shelf. DSP is only for C7 type product, high-end systems. And that's not true. Every system out there can benefit. And we just showed this by being plus minus 3 dB with factory speakers. So if you are on a budget and maybe you're building your system in stages, get that good solid amplifier. You've seen what we can do with factory speakers. And then when your budget allows, then you add those aftermarket speakers, and then it's going to go to the next level and sound even better as we can get more power, improve fidelity out of the drivers. But for me, DSP amplifier, that should be the starting point of a system.
Yeah, especially if you have the ability to dial it in.
Yeah.
I like that. I saw one of the comments in there that not every dealer is going to be able to purchase a Max, and this is true. It's not an inexpensive commitment to your business. We get that. But I think what Matt just showed is the power that Rob was just talking about to extract as much performance out of any system. And that's a tool set, right? Some shops will be able to make that investment. And obviously, as we can fulfill those orders, we will. But he's looking for a dealer in SoCal. So if there's any SoCal dealers that have a Max around, you got someone that's interested in what you might be able to offer there. There's something else that I saw.
I think the other thing, going back to Steve's question real quick.
Oh yeah, what's Steve? Good name.
Well, obviously Max helps with the time domain stuff. We were able to apply some all pass filters and improve the summation, but everything else we did, the EQ, auto set EQ, the global EQ, all of that can be done in Tune 4 for free with a USB or XLR based microphone and sound card. So, you can still get pretty darn close with the free Tune 4 software and $100 USB mic.
Right.
It's just that extra step with the time analysis that Max will give us. But you can still get pretty darn close to where Matt did with just that USB mic and Tune 4.
Right. So the application of those all pass filters, the way you did, that might be a little harder without a Max measurement system. But all the equalization and level stuff, that's I don't want to say free. You still have an investment there with the separate microphone and of course the DSP hardware, right? But yeah, absolutely 100%. But I find that the ability to see into that time domain, to be able to see the phase wraps and all that stuff, and see those changes in real time and toggle on and off to see if it's actually helping or not. That I think there is a value to that. And yeah, I know it's expensive. I get it. But if this is part of what you do for a living, this is a great tool.
So if you're doing DSP tuning for a living, for me, Max is the same as a good router or CNC if you're doing a lot of fabrication. It's
the same kind of thing.
It's the same kind of thing.
It's an investment, but it'll pay off because you get better results faster.
Absolutely.
So, that's good.
So a couple questions that did come in. Jeffrey Hald said when we were talking earlier about the summation around the mid bass and subwoofer region, that he sees the same thing in a lot of his max tunes, that the summation is so good that 100 to 110 hertz is too loud, and he needs to cut it sometimes to not sound bloated. Any thoughts about that?
My first thought, I'm going to interrupt you, is then cut it. and I'm being funny about it because ultimately the data that shows up on the screen is not what is real. What matters is what you hear. And if you're hearing that there's something that doesn't sound right, fix it. You know, the goal of the objective analysis is to get what I call the numbers, the digits to line up when we're displaying those digits as lines, right? The traces that we put, you know, that's showing the quantifiable, something that can be measured and displayed. That's objective analysis. Subjective analysis is when we get in and say, I don't like the way it sounds. There's something wrong with the mid-range, or it's bloated, whatever that means, right? That's harder because it's you know, what we perceive. And if you're perceiving that there's something that's not right, make those changes accordingly.
Now, I got one more thing to add to this. And Jeffrey, you should know better because you're making your own target curves. So what you could do is when you get done tuning this car and it sounds great, capture that measurement and change your target curve so that every time you tune it, that bloatiness is not happening because you already achieved the non-bloaty sound when you finished your target curve.
This is a good point.
So I know you know better, and you should be capturing those traces when you're done measuring.
It's the same thing, though. We always say to do that, and we rarely do it. You know, put the mics back in and capture that data. But to Matt's point, Jeffrey and everyone else that's watching, that is a really good practice. That once you're done, you get in and you do that listening. If you find yourself making the same changes over and over and over again, you may be able to save some of the time when you get to the subjective analysis by building it into the objective analysis. Change the digits so that when you get in to listen to it, they're probably more in line with what you're looking for anyway. And to Jeff's point, if he's noticing this time and again, you know, I'll let Matt have his little ribbing at you there. Change the curve, right? Change the curve, pull some of that energy out so that when you do the match to target, there's less energy in that region by design, right? So that's a good suggestion.
I love what Adam Gary just posted. Now we're limited here, right? We're in a passive network, so you don't normally have true tweeter control. I love this idea. Disable band 10 because that's got a shelving filter on it. That way, when we're done with all of our EQs, in a way, with band 10 as a shelving filter on our EQ, we've got tweeter control.
I actually have a lot of control. You can have, especially using band 10 is a great point. You can put that shelving filter down like in the mid-range area and just taper everything above that.
Yeah,
that's what
a really great idea.
Right. So what I would recommend if you're going to use that shelving filter is save it for the global if you do have a global.
Yeah.
Because that'll affect both tweeters
so
at the same time. And you can adjust that by taste at the end. Now, you can see that in our measurement, we didn't need to do that because we arrived at our target curve without
issue. But it might have sounded bright. It might have sounded different.
But you still have that ability to save it for later if you choose. So
good suggestion, Adam. Love it.
Without a doubt, I heard him actually bumping Push It the other day when we were leaving the office. So Steve's a big
I have salt and pepper, so
you know, I was not going to go there, but it did.
But you were all thinking it. I know all of you thinking it. So.
All right. You know, Glenn Savage said, you know, we talked about factory speakers and the C2 and VXIs. That's his go-to combo. Again, DSP is not about having the most expensive speakers in the world. It's about optimizing what you currently have. And what else do we have here? Calling the kettle black.
Well, you know, actually put that back up because, you know, he makes the comment, excited and just jump in. I get it. I totally get it. Yeah. Just excited. This thing sounds really good. I just want to keep listening to it. I don't want to go through the process of putting the mics back and everything, but do it. Take the time, especially, I mean, if you're an end user and you've done this, I get it, right? But in Jeffrey's case, he tunes a lot of systems, and I think he's working at a retailer now that they're going to be doing even more of that. That extra step is worth it to save that time later and get you to the listening part faster and get better results sooner. So
I did last week. I was just decided to do another new tune on my car. Did it, took an RTA, then I did a global EQ. It's like, oh my gosh, that's so good. I jumped in and listened to it. I didn't capture with the global. So when I went to show them the other day, I'm like, oh, I didn't capture the global EQ RTA. So we all do it.
You know, and to add to that, Jeff, I'll be honest with you. We retune some of the same cars so many times and don't have time to enjoy them because we're always testing new builds of tune and different things. So it's
And
rare that
developing training content too.
Yeah,
So
right.
it's,
So it's rare that we get to sit in a car that's complete and perfect for more than a day before we
Right.
redo
You're
it.
on to
So
the
it's
next
like
thing.
I'm taking 100 measurements, whether I,
Right.
so it's different. But
Going back to Jeffrey's question about that 110 hertz area where he was seeing too good a summation,
Mhm.
Sean Mullen was asking, could you bump the crossover, the high pass filter frequency up, or would that cause more damage to the summation?
well, you could change the high pass filter, but just to be clear, when you're using targets, independent passband targets, the high pass filter, once you align your speaker to the shape of that target, the phase response is going to match that as well.
Mhm.
So you don't want to do too much changing filter frequencies after the fact. You can change it and see if it sounds better, but we wouldn't suggest start over or change it drastically. You could use the high pass, low pass tracking. You could bump it up or down a little bit, see if that helps, or maybe bring one up or down a
I
bit.
think that may be what he's talking about. If you took the high pass filter, not tracking,
Yeah, and just pulled
brought
them
that
apart,
up, it
so
may
it-
create a dropout
Yeah.
of energy, which may
Bleed
be
out some of that
successful.
energy.
Yeah, I mean, you absolutely could,
Yep.
but there's multiple ways to do it. There's
As
no
one-
right or wrong way. It just depends on what you're trying to achieve by doing this.
Now, I will say that when you start making those changes, if you find yourself making significant, massive changes like, 10, 12 dB cuts or staggered filter frequencies, a couple of octaves apart, something's wrong.
Yeah.
At the point you're done with the objective analysis with the digits or the traces all line up, it should be pretty darn close, and it should be minor changes, which is why we call it salt and pepper. It's a little bit of seasoning. It's not the main part of the flavor, right? So if you find yourself making huge changes, you might want to take a step back and wonder why. Maybe we skipped a step in the objective analysis. Maybe something has changed as the process went on. But if you find yourself making really significant changes in that listening portion of it, that's a little red flag saying maybe we got to go look at the data again. So
This is actually a good idea from Josh. I think when I get home, I'm going to set Max up in my car again and do some before and after. So, it's kind of hard to do in an active system because we do have to get our basic filters and stuff set up. But I think before we get into like the auto set EQ and everything, yeah, I'll do that. I'm sure we can work that into a training or even something to post on the Max users group on Facebook or JL for Life or something like that.
Yeah.
Now, I don't have. I mean, Steve and Rob can absolutely do this because they both have equipment in their current cars. I mean, Steve's, like I just said, we redo his every other day. So
That's
I don't have
twice
anything
this week.
I don't have anything currently in my car, but this is my girlfriend's car that you saw us tune today. So there's that.
you have a happy girlfriend now.
Yeah, it'll sound a lot better.
Yeah, no doubt.
But one other thing, Rob, if you can bring up the screen one last time.
Yeah, absolutely.
I just wanted to
This is
show
good. Yeah.
what we came from to what we left with, and how this is just one speaker playing on the blue trace, but the green traces are final, right? So it's what you can do with VXI and global EQ. It's really cool, and you can get some really good sound, and you can get even closer than this if there were better speakers in the car and better door dampening and better installation techniques. Damping, I'm sorry. There's factory speakers are only so great. So so with a set of C2, C3, C7s and better install, this curve would be even tighter.
So I see there's another comment from Jeffrey Hall, and I think he may be trying to be funny, and I'm not picking on you, Jeff, at all. But can you oversalt a tune? Yes, you can. You wind up overdoing it. You're trying to add too much seasoning to it. You can wind up ruining the dish. Yes, absolutely. That's why I say if you find yourself making significant changes in that listening portion of it, you've oversalted the tune. To Jeffrey's point, absolutely, you can overdo it.
I mean, I think that's pretty easy if you keep the salt shaking a little too long, right?
Like I found,
but if someone takes the top off,
for me, like salt and pepper, for me, it's usually maybe the stage sounds a little to the left. Let me lower the left half a dB, a dB. Okay,
kind of stuff.
It sounds a little too crisp than I would like. Let me maybe attenuate the level trim on both tweeters, half a dB, a dB and a half. It should nothing more than 2 or 3 dB most of the time if you're pretty solid on the measurements. But again, it all depends on the user, and if you're a retailer and the installer, it doesn't stop when you listen to it. It stops when your customer listens to it.
Absolutely.
So that again, when they pick up the car, get them in it, make the salt and pepper for them. And I always recommend, tell them to come
Paprika.
back. Tell a little paprika, maybe a little garlic salt, actually.
Cajun season.
Tell them to come back, listen to it for a couple weeks, come back in, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and we'll make any final small adjustments that may be needed. If they still find it's more aggressive than they like. Again, maybe just a little bit of attenuation on the mid-range or tweeter. Nothing drastic. For me, it's usually just levels at that point, and you'll have it dialed in.
That's it. 100%. Well, we went a little long, but it was good. I think some of the conversation we had at the end added a lot to what Matt shared with us. And again, I was excited to be able to tune a more normal system, something that's not over the top, that's not all the highest level equipment. And I think what Matt was able to demonstrate, that even using basic speakers that are factory speakers, that the customer or you didn't have to spend a lot of money on those, that we could get them to sound really good, or at least dial in really close. And when we get in and listen to it, I know that this car sounded actually really nice when we did the tune on it. So hopefully that information was helpful. Obviously, we have more training sessions that we'll do as we go forward. We're always looking for your feedback. If there's anything you want us to cover in more detail or in more depth, it doesn't have to be just tune and max related. It could be on any product that we offer, or any technical topic that maybe we can share some information that we may have.
We should do an online session about Ohm's law.
Oh boy. It's so important, but nobody wants to cover that. But
it's the basis.
It comes into so many different things. There are some things that I'm thinking about on that note. So, but I don't. It's late. People have been watching for a long time. We appreciate everyone's attention. The feedback today was really good. The dialogue that we had was excellent. I think the demonstration that Matt put together for us was really very, very helpful. And thank you for that. Thank you for being our producer and jumping on the chat there. So I'll stop talking now. Thank you again for watching, and you guys.
Bye, guys.
See you later. Thanks, everybody.